Hi guys, welcome back. So from the previous videos, we are ready with the environment setup and the project structure. So let's see what is the agenda for today's video. Okay, so today we need to understand what is a component in React, what are the different types of component in React, what are the life cycle methods of class component, and what are the useful hooks in functional component. So without wasting any time, let's get started with the first question. Okay. So what is a component? Okay. So component are independent and reusable bits of code. Okay. So this React uses a component based architecture. So what do you mean by a component? Component are independent, means it is not dependent upon each other, and it is reusable, means once you create a component, you can use it in the multiple screens. Okay, so that is the biggest advantage of using a component based architecture in React. Okay, so they serve the same purpose as JavaScript functions but work in isolation and returns JSX. What is component? It is just a JavaScript function, that's it. Okay, what it returns? It returns JSX. Okay, so what is JSX? JavaScript and XML. Okay, so React Native has some elements like a view, text. Okay, and we can write JavaScript inside that. Okay, so that is JSX for you. Okay, so I hope you understood what is component. So component is a independent and reusable bit of code. Okay, so next let's see the types of components. So there are two types of component. Okay, class-based component and functional component. Okay, so let's see the difference between the functional and the class-based component. Okay, so the functional component is just a plain JavaScript function that accepts props as an argument. Okay, so the functional component, what it accepts the props. Okay, and it returns what? It returns a React element, which is what? JSX. Okay, so it accepts a prop and returns a JSX. Okay, so we'll see how we can create a functional component. Okay, so first let's understand what is class component also. Okay, so the class component extends from React component, react.component, and create a render function which returns a React element. Okay, so we have to extend react.component and then we can use it inside the render function. Okay, so there are this is a big difference between a functional and a class component. Class component has render function, function component doesn't have a render function. Okay, so let's jump into code and build both the functions, functional as well as class based components. Okay, so in the previous video when we did an init command and we had a hello world project, right? So let's delete this and we will write it from the scratch. Okay, so first thing what I'm doing is I am importing React from React. Okay, then I'm importing some elements like view and text from React hyphen native. Okay, now we will be creating a functional component first. Functional component. Okay, so what is a functional component? Functional component is a simple JavaScript function, right? So const app, okay, equals, and what it takes as an argument, it takes props as an argument, right? So props as an argument. So I'll take props as an argument and I'll create a arrow function, and what it returns the React element, which is the JSX. So I'll write a view. So view is a JSX element, and inside this I'll write a text, and inside text I'll write hello from app component. Okay, and I have to export it so that index.js file can import it. Export default app. Okay, so this is a functional component for you. Okay, it takes the props as an argument and it returns a JSX. Okay, so let's see how it looks in the screen. Okay, so let's see the screen. Hello from app component. Okay, so this is good, right? We have created a functional component. Okay, now let's see how we can create a class component. So I'll remove this thing and let's see now how we can create a class component. Okay, So for class component, I have to use class as a keyword, and then I have to say app, and it should extend what? It should extend React dot component. It should extend what? React dot component. Okay, and it has a render method. Okay, it has a render method, and inside this render method, you can return your JSX. You can return your JSX. So view, and inside this you can write text, and inside this hello from app compo. Okay, so let's save it. The output remains the same, right? It is loading from localhost. Okay, so let's see. Okay, it got built it, and tada, hello from app component. So we have seen both functional component and class based component. Okay, so the second difference is there is no render method, right? So in functional component, we didn't write any render method. We have just returned a JSX. But in the class component, we wrote a render method. Inside that, we returned a JSX, right? Then next point is what also known as stateless component. Okay, so what is a state? A state is something which holds the information about the data, the information about the component. Okay, so functional component doesn't have a state. Okay, but class component has state. Okay, so what do you mean by this? We will see in the next question, which is when we will create the life cycle hooks. Okay, and the last point is React lifecycle methods like component did mount cannot be used in the functional component, but it can be used in the class component. Okay, so this will be clear once we write the lifecycle hooks. Okay, so let's jump into the third question, which is the class component lifecycle. Okay, so now till now we have understood what is a component and what is a functional and class-based component and how we can create it. Okay, the next thing is we have to understand is what is a class component lifecycle. Okay, so what do you mean by a life cycle? Okay, so like a human has a life cycle, right? So he or she is born, then he or she studies, right? Then go to college, then get married, then work, then children, then retire, and then die. So this is life cycle of a human, right? Every human goes through this. The same way a class has a life cycle. Okay, so the class life cycle is in three phases: mounting, updating, and unmounting. Mounting, updating, and unmounting. Okay, so let's see by a diagram. Okay, so mounting, updating, and unmounting. So mounting calls constructor, then render, then component did mount. Okay, updating calls render and then component did mount, and unmounting calls component will unmount. Okay, and in between there are some methods which get called. We have to understand that also, right? So let's see one by one the life cycle methods. Okay, so let's go inside this. Okay, so I have created a class based component. Okay, let's copy this and create another class based component of login. Okay, and I have to export login. Okay, and hello from login component. So I've created a login component as well. Okay, so let's see the first function, which is a constructor. Okay, so what is a constructor? Okay, so constructor is called first when the class component starts to render, right? So constructor is basically the first thing which gets called. Okay, and I can prove that by doing a console.log. Okay, and I can say constructor. Okay, and what things you can do inside the constructor? You can do it as an initialization. Okay, so if you want to initialize something, you can use a constructor for it. Okay, so let's say I have to initialize a state. So this dot state. Okay, and inside the state I have to say suppose count colon 0. Okay, so I have a state which has a variable count which is initialized to 0. Okay, so constructor is the first thing which gets called, and you can do an initialization inside this. Okay, so let me save it. Okay, so there is an error here, right? Undefined is not an object, this dot save. Okay, why is this happening? Because we have to call the constructor of the component class as well. For that we have to use a super. Okay, so inside this super you have to pass the props. Okay, so it will call the component constructor as well. Okay, so once we save it, okay, then this error will be gone. Okay, and you'll see that constructor is getting called first when the app gets loaded, right? So this is the first method. Okay, what is the second method? Okay, let's go for the second method. So get derived state from props. Get derived state from props, as the name suggests, get derived state from props. So you want to get some state from the props you have passed, right? So let's say there is a login module, right? So let's say I have a constructor here also. So constructor, inside that we have to write props, and then inside that you can write a super. Inside this super you can pass props. Okay, and then you can say this dot state equals, and inside this you can uh, write the count which is particular to this login component. Okay, and then you can show that count here. Okay, so let me change the statement here. Login component, login component count. Okay, login component count, right? And here I'll say app component count. App component count. Okay, and here I have to say this dot state dot, right? And here also I have to say the same, this dot state dot count. Okay, so now login has a count variable. Okay, and app also have a count variable. Okay, so let's say we have to increment a count here. So what I'll do, I'll create a button. So button. Okay, and I have to import this button here. It is already imported, very good. Then next we have to give a title to the button. So let's say increment from app gs. Okay, and here you can write on press, on press, and inside this on press you can write like this dot set state, and inside this you can write count colon this dot state. Okay, so let me take it in the next line. This dot state dot count plus 1. Okay, so let's save it. Okay, and let's see if the button is here. Yes, the button is there. Once I click on the button, it increments the count. Okay, so this is from the app component, right? This is from the app component. Okay, now let's suppose I have to render login also. Okay, so let's say from after the button I have to go to the login module. Okay, and like this I have to see. So login should be imported. So it is imported. Yes, it is imported. So let's save it. Okay, and let's see if login is getting loaded or not. Okay, yeah. So login component count is 0. Okay, so once I click on the button, only the state of app component changes, but not of login component. Okay, so let's say there is a button in login also, and inside this, okay, I have to import button, and you have to import the button. Okay, and this should be increment from login. Okay, and this should say this dot set dot state count is equal to set count plus 1, right? Okay, so let's see now. Okay, so we have two buttons, one is for app and one is for login. So if I change the app, okay, it changes. Once I click on login, it changes the login one, right? Okay, now the why we did this is because we have to understand this method, get derived state from props. Okay, so let's see the documentation and let's see what it takes as an argument. Okay, so get derived states from props. This is here. Okay, so let's take this. So this is a static method. Oh, it's a static method and it takes props and state as an argument. Okay, so let me create this. So static and this. Okay, and console dot log to say get derived state from props, and I have to say props and state. Okay, I am just printing props and states. Okay, now I suppose from the app.js I have to pass the count of this particular state into the login screen. Okay, login component. So what I can do is I can say count is equal to this dot state dot count. Okay, so I'm passing a count to the login screen. Okay, and what I'm doing, I'm taking it here. Okay, so in the props I will get the count of the app. Okay, and in the state I'll get the count of the login. Okay, so this is the use of the get derived state from props. Okay, you can get the state of previous component in the props and you can get the state of the current component as well. Okay, so let's save it and let's see if we are going correct or not. Okay, so it says a warning. Okay, so what is a warning? Login dot get derived state from prop, a valid state object must be returned. Okay, so it should return something. Okay, so let's say I don't want to return anything as of now, I just want to check, so I'll say return none and save it. Okay, so see, get derived state from props. Okay, the count is 0 and here also the count is 0. Okay, so if I'll increment in the app.js, okay, let's say I make it as 10. Okay, so at that time if you'll see the console, the props has been increased but this is same. Okay, so if I increase for the login, okay, you'll see. So suppose I've done it 9, so you'll see that these are increasing, but this is not increasing. Okay, so you can get the state from props and you can get the current state in get derived state from props function. Okay, so you understood what is the use of this function. Okay, the next thing is render. Okay, so render is basically used for rendering JSX, which we are already doing. Render. Okay, so render gets called after the constructor and after the get derived state from props. Okay, so render is being called after these two methods. Okay, so if you want me to prove, okay, so I can console log here, console.log, say constructor, and here I can say console dot log render. Okay, so let's see first the constructor is getting called, then get derived state from props with the props in the state, and then the render. Okay, so render is called after these two. Okay, we have proved that. Okay, next is the component did mount. Okay, so component did mount gets called after the render. After the render, component did mount get called. Okay, so let's prove that. Okay, so see, constructor get derived state from props. Okay, so it is not refreshed. Okay, now it is refreshed. Constructor get derived state from props, render, and then component did mount. Okay, so component did mount will be called after the render function. Okay, so once you have render your JSX, then after that, if you want to do something, you can do it here. For example, you want to call the API once it is getting rendered, the JSX is getting rendered, then you can do it inside the component did mount function. Okay, so this is the component did mount function. Okay, so these are the four functions for the mounting. Okay, so I hope you understood. Okay, next is for updating. So for updating, what is getting called? First, get derived state from props. Okay, so we already have this function, get derived state from props. So once the state or props get updated, this function is getting called. Okay, so for example, if I'll update the state of from the login, let's say I'll put it as 1 and 2, you will see in the console log. Okay, it is getting called get derived state from props. Okay, so once a prop or a state gets changes, after that only this get derived state from props is called. Okay, so the first method is clear, right? The next method is should component update. Okay, so this is basically a question to you. Okay, this is basically a question, should component update? Okay, yes or no. Okay, so this means what? It returns what? It returns a boolean, either true or false, either true or false. Okay, so it means what? Once the prop or state gets changes, okay, after that you want to re-render your component or you don't want to re-render your component. Okay, so should component update after getting props and state updated? If it is true, then it will call the render method. If it is false, it will not call the render method. Okay, so let me make it as false. Okay, and let's see. Okay, so okay, so it takes next props and next state. Okay, so let's give it next props and next state. Okay, and now if you'll see, now if you'll see, I am hitting on the increment from login and it is not incrementing. Why? Because it is not re-rendering. Okay, it is not re-rendering because we have set this to false. Because we have set this to false. Okay, so you understood what is the meaning of this? Should component update after the props and state updated? No, then you have to give it as false. Okay, so what is the next? Render. Okay, so render is called once the props and state has been updated. So that's a simple thing, right? Next is the get snapshot before update. Okay, get snapshot before update. So let's see how this function look like and what is the previous props and previous state it takes. Okay, so I'll write this and inside this I'll console log previous props comma previous state. Okay, so get snapshot before update. So what it does, it gives you the previous states and previous props. Okay, so once I'll save this and let's make it to true. Okay, then let's go to the app and let's reload. Reload. Okay, and see there is a warning. What is the warning? Get snapshot before update should be used with the component did update. Okay, so there is a function called as component did update. You have to write it. Okay, you have to write it inside your code. Okay, so I'll go and I'll write component did update. Okay, so that was our next function, component did update. So this will work with this, otherwise it won't work. Okay, So component did update means what? Whenever the component updates and you have to do something, you can do it inside the component did update. Okay, so I'll write component did update called. Okay, so this function, okay, is will work with component did mount only. Okay, so these were the updating ones. Okay, so you can get the previous state and previous props here. Okay, you can do whatever after the update here, and you can re-render your component based on true or false value. Okay, so this is basically the updating thing. Okay, and the last is the unmounting thing. Okay, so if you want to do something on unmount, let's say you want to remove some state value, or you want to remove something, then you can use component will unmount. Okay, so let's see how this function looks like. Okay, so it doesn't take anything, it will just unmount your console.log unmounted. Okay, okay, so if first time the app is loaded, constructor is called. Okay, this is getting called twice because I have printed in app also and login also. Then get derived state from props, then render, and then component did mount. Okay, once the state changes, okay, once the state changes, at that time, which is getting called, okay, so at that time get derived state from props, render, and then component did update. Okay, is getting, and once it is unmounted, it will call the unmount method. Okay, so you can do unmounted things here. Okay, so this is about the life cycle methods. Okay, and the last thing I have to talk about is the hooks in functional component. Okay, so we have made a statement in the difference that this is a stateless component. Okay, so if we want to use a state inside this, then what should I do? Okay, if I want a component did mount in the functional component, what should I do? Okay, so for that, React has introduced a hooks concept. Okay, so let's see how the hooks works. Okay, so let's remove these things and let's create a functional component with a hook. Okay, so for functional component, I have to say constant app equals arrow function, and inside this I have to return a JSX, which will be view, and inside this view I will write a text, and this text will be hello. Okay, this is the simple functional component. Okay, now let's introduce to the new functional. Let's get introduced to the new function, which is a use state hook. Okay, so what is a use state hook? It is used to store a state in the functional component. Okay, so let's say we have taken a count and set count, and initial value is 0. Okay, so here I have to give a variable setter function and the initial value to the use state hook, and I have to import it from the React like this in the brackets. Okay, so this is the use state hook. Okay, so if I want to show the count, I can show it like hello, and after that I can directly show the count here. Okay, so if we'll see the application, let's reload. Okay, so hello 0, so initial state is getting rendered. Okay, now if you want to change the state and let the component re-render, what you have to do, let's say I have a button. Inside the button I have a title, let's say increment, and on press I am calling, let's say, increment function. Okay, and I'll create this increment function. So increment constant increment is equal to, and then brackets, arrow function, and here I can call set count. Okay, so set count is equal to count plus 1. So what it will do, it will increment the count to 1. Okay, so let's see if this works or not. So initially it is 0. Once I increment, it increments to 13, 14, 15, 16. Okay, so this is a use state hook. Okay, and if you want to take a component did mount inside your functional component, then the use effect hook we can use. Okay, so inside this use effect, I am removing these things. Okay, remove this also. A normal callback function. Okay, so inside this, what you can do, you can simply write console.log to check if it is getting called or not on the render. Okay, so console.log use effect. Okay, so let's see if it is getting called or not. Okay, so reuse effect I have to import also. So let's import use effect from React. So use effect from React. Okay, see, use effect is getting called. So every time it renders, it calls a use effect. Okay, so this is the use effect too. Okay, so if you want a use effect to be called only once the page get rendered, then you have to pass a second argument, and that should be an empty array. Okay, so if we'll pass it as an empty array, it will call only once. It will call only once, and it will not call every time the component is rendered. Okay, and the third case is if you want particular variable is updated, then only we have to re-render. Then you have to give that variable inside the. Okay, so once increment is called, it will call use effect also. See, it will call use effect, right? So once increment is called, it will call use effect. See, right? So this is a use effect hook. Okay, so you can use a use state and use effect hook. Okay, alternative of component date mount, and this is for this dot state. Okay,